Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's program hosted by the Nathan and Esther Peril Holocaust Education Resource Center, also known as HERC, in partnership with the Aryan Rose Samson Family Jewish Community Center, both located in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. My name is Samantha Abramson, and I am the new executive director at HERC. It is my honor to introduce tonight's featured speaker, Timothy Boyce. Tonight's program is one of many we at HERC have planned for the upcoming few months. Please visit our events page on our website, which we'll put in a link on this chat, so that you can learn more about upcoming programs, including programs like the one we're having on February 21st with Dr. Racheli Kreisberg, granddaughter of Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal. Programs like this one are made possible in part thanks to the generous support of our donors. To support HERC's mission to promote Holocaust education throughout the state and encourage future generations to take on leadership roles within their own communities, please donate online at the link that we'll also add in this chat box. Given the size of tonight's crowd, we have opted to mute your participant microphones. Please use the chat box to submit your questions for a Q&A session, which will follow tonight's program, hosted by HERC's Education Manager, Sarah Sillers. It is now my privilege to introduce tonight's speaker, Timothy Boyce, editor of From Day to Day, One Man's Diary of Survival in Nazi Concentration Camps. Originally written by Norwegian political prisoner and Holocaust survivor Odd Nansen. First published in 1949, this extraordinary diary, written by a non-Jewish victim of the Nazi regime and its collaborators, is a rich historical document with stunning illustrations by Nansen himself. We see through his eyes and imagine what he describes. We follow him day by day inside the concentration camp system during World War II for nearly 3.5 years. As editor of the republished 2016 diary, Timothy Boyce frames the diary beautifully, setting the diary within the larger context of Nansen's life and offering editorial notes to guide readers through the text. Prior to his retirement in 2014 to pursue writing full-time, which we're so grateful he did, Timothy Boyce practiced law for 35 years, most recently as the managing partner of the Charlotte office of Dr. LLP, an international law firm. Tim holds an MBA from the Wharton School of Finance, a JD from the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and a BS in Foreign Service from Georgetown University. Without further ado, it is my privilege to introduce Timothy Boyce.
Thank you so much, Samantha, for that very kind introduction. And thank you all out there for joining me tonight. I'm speaking to you from Western North Carolina. And I'm going to be speaking to you tonight about a gentleman, as Samantha mentioned, named Odd Nansen. Probably never heard of him. And I'm going to be speaking to you in particular about his experiences during World War II while he was a prisoner for over 3 years in various prisons and concentration camps, and the diary that he kept, one of the very, very few diaries ever written inside of a concentration camp. And of that group, an even smaller number of which have ever been translated into English. So let me begin by pulling up my PowerPoint. So if you'll bear with me for 1 second. There we go. So as I say, I'm going to be talking about Odd Nansen and his diary. Here's a picture of the book, the diary itself. Now to begin tonight, I'd like to begin actually by telling you a story. And I'd like you all to participate with me, do a little bit of role playing, as you will. First of all, I'd like you all to imagine that you are once again a 10-year-old child. Second, I'd like you to imagine that instead of the date being early February 2021, imagine the date is late January 1945. And finally, I'd like you to imagine that instead of waking up in a nice soft bed and a nice cozy house in Milwaukee, where many of you are located, or wherever you may be tuning in from, in my case, again, Western North Carolina, imagine you find yourself waking up in a concentration camp called Auschwitz. And the guards have just come into your barracks, and they're screaming and they're shouting and they're bellowing the command, Raus, Raus. Raus is a German word that means out. Everybody out. We're evacuating this camp. So you line up outside your barracks, you join this marching column that is already miles long, you slowly make your way out through the front gate. For the next 3 days, you march in this column through the snow and the ice and the mud and the slush in bitterly cold temperatures, as only January in Eastern Europe can be like. In fact, I checked the weather report. I know it's very cold out in Milwaukee right now. You're having a storm advisory. Well, it's also cold in Auschwitz at this time. The temperature is about 34 degrees. The next couple of days, the nightly temperature will go down into the teens. I think it's coming Friday. The low temperature will be 6 degrees Fahrenheit. So you march through these conditions for 3 days, at which point you reach a rail junction. When you get to the rail junction, you're put on a train that consists of cattle cars. Cattle cars have 4 sides. They have no roof. They have no heat. They have no protection from the elements. And you're going to spend the next 10 days in that cattle car as this train slowly makes its way out of southwestern Poland, takes a long detour through Czechoslovakia, and finally turns north into Germany and comes to a stop about 25 miles north of Berlin at another concentration camp, this one called Sachsenhausen. And when you get there, you're grateful that you're still alive. Thousands of people died in just that 2-week period in what became known in history as the Auschwitz Death March. But as I say, you're one of the lucky ones. You're one of the survivors. But that doesn't mean that you're not suffering by this point. It doesn't mean you're not hurting as well. In fact, by the time you get to Sachsenhausen, you can barely walk into the camp under your own power. You've got terrific pains in both of your feet. But up until now, you dare not take off your boots. You haven't taken them off since you left Auschwitz for a variety of reasons, including the fear that if you take them off, somebody larger and stronger than you, remember you're only a 10-year-old child, will steal them from you. I mean, by January 1945, the world has descended into a dog-eat-dog world where people are prepared to do literally just about anything to try to stay alive. But now that you're in Sachsenhausen, you take off your boots to see what's wrong with your feet. And you see that your feet no longer look like the palm of my hand. Your feet have turned completely black. Black from a severe case of frostbite. In fact, so severe that the flesh on your toes is already beginning to rot. So you know you have to go to the infirmary. The German word for the infirmary was the Revier. You know you have to go there to get some medical attention. I mean, that after all, it sounds logical, doesn't it? And when you and I get sick, we get medical attention and we get better. But in the crazy upside-down world of the concentration camp, which was completely illogical, the Revier was actually considered the most dangerous place you could go. The prisoners called it the waiting room for the gas chamber. Because if you think about it, if you're lying in bed, you're not working. If you're not working, you're not contributing anything to the camp. If you're not contributing, why should the camp spend any resources trying to keep you alive? Every prisoner is completely expendable. If you die, just another nameless prisoner is going to take your place in line anyways. But you also know that if you don't get medical attention, given the condition of your feet, you're either going to get gangrene, you're going to get blood poisoning, you're going to get sepsis, any one of which is going to kill you in the end anyways. So you screw up your courage, you report to the infirmary, and luckily for you, there's a kindly doctor on duty that day, a prisoner, not a Nazi doctor. And he takes one look at your feet, and he picks you up right then and there by the scruff of your clothes, carries you over to an operating table, gives you a whiff of ether, knocks you unconscious. And the next thing you remember is you're slowly coming to, and you look around and you realize you're now lying in a bed in the Revier. You look down at your feet and you see that both of them are heavily bandaged. And the orderlies in that hospital ward explained to you that the doctor had to amputate a couple of your toes in order to save your feet. Now, you're probably lying in bed wondering, how long can I stay here before a Nazi doctor walks in and sees me? What am I going to do then? I'm a 10-year-old child using up a hospital bed. Prospects don't look good. In the meantime, hundreds, if not thousands, of prisoners are streaming through the Revier at all hours of the day and night. By the spring of 1945, Sachsenhausen had a prisoner population in excess of 35,000 people. It was the size of a small city. And there's one thing all these prisoners have in common, which is they're not paying the slightest bit of attention to you. I mean, after all, they don't know who you are. You're not from their village. You're not part of their extended family. And the most important rule in the camp is you look out for number one, you look out for yourself. You don't worry about other people, least of all, strangers who you don't even know. And then one day, a middle-aged man comes into the infirmary. He's coming to visit one of his friends who is sick. Instead of walking right by you, like everyone else has, he stops. He starts talking to you. He can speak the same language you speak, German. So he asks you, child, what's your name? How did you get into Sachsenhausen? Where did you come from? Do you know where your parents are? Do you have any siblings? In fact, do you know anybody at all in this camp? In other words, this one individual is at least showing some interest in you and in your plight. Now, why am I telling you this story in the first place? Well, first reason is that is a true story. The young child that I've just been describing was a boy named Thomas Bergenthal. Here's a picture of Tommy taken in 1938. He's all of 4 years old in this picture. And he would be taken captive along with his mother and father by the Nazis in the fall of 1939, the very beginning of World War II, and remain a prisoner of the Nazis for the entire duration of World War II, for no other reason other than the fact that he was a Jew. And the man who stopped to talk to him was a Norwegian named Odd Nansen. Now, the second reason why I'm telling you this story is that accidental meeting between these two people ended up changing both of their lives. In Tommy's case, it literally meant the difference between life and death, between living and dying. Because from that day forward, Nansen used his food and tobacco rations to bribe the orderlies in that hospital ward to look out for young Tommy, to protect him, to make sure his name did not show up on the selection list that was being periodically created to send off prisoners to, quote unquote, make room in the infirmary for more prisoners. Now, some of you out there might be thinking to yourself, how does Nansen have enough food and tobacco that he can be giving it away in the form of bribes? I thought everybody was starving in these camps. How could he have possibly have survived if he was giving away what little he had? But that's not really an accurate picture of what life in these large concentration camps was like. They were very highly stratified, and they were highly stratified on the basis of race, because the Nazis viewed the world through the lens of race. To them, race somehow explained how the world actually worked, and then in turn, race guided how they would treat the world. And in what they called their Weltanschauung, which means their worldview, of course, the Nazis believed that they belonged to the Aryan race. And the Aryan race was the master race, the Heldenvolk, that was destined to rule this new world order throughout conquered Europe. At the bottom of the totem pole, of course, the Nazis put the Jews, who they considered to be Untermenschen, subhuman, fit for nothing other than ultimate extermination. But the Nazis had to find a place in this pecking order for every race. We would call them generally nationalities, but they would call them races, so they would know how to deal with them. And the Nazis looked at the Scandinavians, and they said, in many ways, you are racially akin to us. I mean, after all, you're tall, you're blonde-haired, you're blue-eyed. I mean, you're like our first cousins. You're not Aryan because you're not Germanic, but you're pretty darn close. So in this pecking order, we're going to put you just below us, ahead of basically everybody else in the camp. And by virtue of the fact that they held the Scandinavian prisoners, the Norwegians and the Danes, in fairly high regard, they allowed them one benefit that they did not allow to any other prisoners in the camp. And that is they allowed them to receive food parcels from the Red Cross. And if you had food in a concentration camp, you were rich. You could get anything you wanted with food. One of the questions that's often asked me in these talks is, how did Nansen get to write a diary? How did he get his hands on paper and pencil? Getting your hands on a paper and pencil was the easiest thing in the world to accomplish if you had food. In fact, just to give you an idea of how much corruption there was in Sachsenhausen, by the summer of 1944, there was actually an operating brothel inside the concentration camp. But again, you needed food because food was the currency of the camp. So Nansen had the wherewithal, by virtue of these Red Cross parcels, to try to save Tommy. Now, a few moments ago, I mentioned that this chance meeting changed both their lives. Think about it. that a 10-year-old boy who's just had some of his toes amputated can possibly do to help a fairly well-off, a fairly healthy middle-aged man. But I think if you read Nansen's diary, you have to come to the conclusion that by the spring of 1945, that Nansen, although physically in good shape, is heading for a mental breakdown. The tone of his diary entries are getting increasingly distressed. I mean, by this time, he's been in different camps for over 3 years. He has seen every kind of brutality, cruelty imaginable. And every time he thinks to himself, things can't get any worse, of course, they would always get worse. And so this is what Nansen wrote, not in his diary, but in a book he wrote after the war about his meeting with Tommy. He says, everywhere I went in the camp, Tommy's angelic face popped up. Without suspecting it, Tommy accomplished with us a work of salvation. He touched something in us which was about to disappear. He called to life again human feelings, which were painful to have, but which nevertheless meant salvation for us all. Now, the third reason why I'm telling you this story is that chance meeting between these two people changed my life as well. Now, you can see that I am not old enough to have even been alive during World War II, and it would take over 60 years for that event to intersect with my life and change it forever. Now, as you can see, looking over my shoulder, I'm speaking to you from my library. This is not wallpaper. This is my actual library. And virtually every one of these books behind me is a history book. I just love reading history. And any chance I get to go to a bookstore to see what new history books there are, I'm always there to check it out. So going back 11 years now to the year 2010, I went into a bookstore in Charlotte, North Carolina, because I was practicing law there. Went to the history section, and I saw this new book that had just been published, a book called The Lucky Child, written by somebody named Thomas Bergenthal. I had never heard of Bergenthal. I'd never heard of the book. As I said, it had just been published. But that subtitle, if you can see, it's a little bit fuzzy there, A Memoir of Surviving Auschwitz as a Young Boy. That's what caught my eye. So I picked up this book really on an impulse, took it home and started reading it. And by the way, that young boy on the left of this picture on the cover, that's a picture of Tommy again in the summer of 1945. He's all of 11 years old in that picture. He's now spent, at this point, more than 50% of his entire existence on Earth as a prisoner of the Nazis. And when I got this book home and started reading it, I learned the story that I just related to you. How Tommy takes part in the evacuation of Auschwitz, how he ends up in Sachsenhausen with frostbitten feet. He has some of his toes amputated. He explains how Nansen steps in and starts bribing the orderlies in order to keep him alive. And at this point in Tom's memoir, he says, and by the way, this Odd Nansen fellow who saved my life, he kept a diary. And then Tom adds just one footnote on the bottom of page 177. I think you can all read that. It's only 6 or 7 lines long. And it's nothing more than a description of this diary that he's mentioned up in the text. Obviously published, since he was Norwegian, in Norway in 1947, then translated into English and German in 1949. And when I came across this footnote, I made a mental note to myself, maybe this diary would be an interesting book as well. Certainly Tom's memoir has been an absolutely fascinating book. Maybe this is equally interesting. I've never heard of it again. I've never heard of this fellow Odd Nansen. In fact, I probably at that point couldn't have told you anything about Norway's experience in the war. But again, if you look at this, if you've got this many history books, in my house in total has probably more than 5,000 books in total, the bar to purchase another book is pretty easy. I need no impetus at all to get me to buy another book. And I realized, of course, being that this book was published in 1949, that it's not going to be in a bookstore. I'm going to have to go where? I'm going to have to go on the internet. Everything in the world that somebody is selling somewhere is available on the internet. So I do my search, and of course I know where to find used and out of print books because I buy them all the time. To locate, after my search, after an exhaustive search, one single copy of this book for sale in the entire United States. One book. I could find 2 more books for sale in Great Britain, 1 in Australia, and 1 in New Zealand. 5 in the entire globe. Where all the other books have disappeared to or had disappeared to at that point, I have no answer for that. So I ended up buying one of those books, and it came in the mail. I bought it from the bookseller in New Zealand, in fact. And the only thing I knew about it was the title in this description, in this footnote. So when the book arrives, and here's a copy of the book, you can see it's a relatively hefty book. It was way over 500 pages. And so I thought to myself, you know, being a diary, this is a slightly different animal than a memoir or a history. It's something that's going to be somewhat repetitious because the person who writes it has no control over the narrative arc. They simply have to write, you know, an accurate depiction of what they see and what they feel and what they experience. So this could either be as fascinating as perhaps the Diary of Anne Frank, or it could be incredibly repetitious. So I kind of dipped my toe in it pretty gingerly. I read only a few pages when I first got it, and they were pretty good. And the next night I read a few more pages. The next night I read even more pages. And the next night I read even more pages. And you can see this pattern developing. I got within probably no more than 10 days or 2 weeks, I got to the point where I was completely hooked by this book. I could not put this thing down. I carried it with me everywhere. I would even bring it to work, and I'd say to my secretary, listen, Linda, I've got this really important loan agreement I've got to draft this morning. I need total concentration. I can't have any disruptions. Hold my calls, no visitors. I'm going to close the door. I don't want anybody to disturb me. And of course, what I was doing is I was actually just reading this book. Before I'd even finished reading it, this thought kept occurring to me. How can it be that the book like this, which I consider to be nothing short of a masterpiece, to be better than practically any other book that you'll find in my library, how can it be that no one else has reprinted this book in over 60 years? I mean, that's an entire lifetime. How has this book stayed under the radar for so long? And again, I don't have an answer to that either. But if you think about it, if there's only 5 copies of this book for sale on the internet anywhere in the world, the chances of anybody even knowing about the book or finding it or reading it is pretty darn small. After I purchased my 1 copy, now there's 4 copies for sale on the internet. So I made up my mind that I would try to get this book back into print. And I decided at the get-go that rather than just take this old book, this old copy, and give it to a typist, professional typist, and have them transcribe it into essentially a digital document so I could then manipulate it and send it off to publishers, I decided that I would be the editor of this diary as well. I would try to explain through annotations the who, the what, the why. Who are the people that Nansen's in prison with? What prisons were he in? What places did he go to? What did he hear about World War II? He heard about battles, you know, the Battle of Stalingrad or the massacre at the Katyn Forest or Operation Torch. What do they mean? If you're not well versed in World War II history, it's all going to kind of go right over your head. So I decided I would annotate all this. I would also add photographs and as well as a lengthy introduction. And I really thought that this might take me 18 months, maybe at the outside, 2 years to get this book back into print. But I really had no true clue how one did this. Well, it ended up taking me 6 years until 2016 to get the book back into print, both because I made a lot of rookie mistakes, but also because I started delving further and further and further into this research. And I wanted to make sure I unearthed everything I possibly could about anything dealing with this diary. And as I showed you that original picture, and as I'm holding up here, this is the new edited and fully annotated version of Nansen's diary. So what I'd like to do in the time we have available to us tonight is just give you a little bit of an overview of why I thought this diary was so special. And even more importantly, I hope you come away with an appreciation for what a remarkable man Odd Nansen was. Because to me, that's more than any other reason. I think that's what kept me going for 6 years, determined to get this book back into print. So let's kind of go through the who, what, why, where, and when. So who was Odd Nansen? Well, here's a family photograph. This picture is taken in the spring of 1902, and Odd Nansen was born in December of 1901. So you can figure out from this picture that he is the young baby held in his mother's arms in this photograph. And as you can see, he's the 4th child born to his parents. His mother's name was Eva Sars Nansen, and his father's name was Fridtjof Nansen. Both of his parents came from very well-to-do families in Norway, Norwegian society. Both of his parents are very accomplished in their own rights. They were both very, very artistic. His mother was both a singer and an artist, and his father was also a very good artist. And we're gonna see some of Nansen's artistry himself, some of his artwork, sketches that he drew while he was a prisoner in these different camps. Unfortunately for him, his mother died when he was only 6 years old. She died in 1907 of pneumonia. So Nansen was pretty much raised single-handedly by his father, the gentleman in the upper right of that photograph. And although the name Fridtjof Nansen means practically nothing to us Americans, he is considered probably the most famous man the country of Norway has ever produced. He was a polar explorer. At one point, he held the record for getting closest to the North Pole. He was only 31 years old when he did that. Then in his 40s, he became a statesman. He helped Norway achieve its independence from Sweden. Norway had been part of Sweden until 1905, and he was able to convince Sweden to give up Norway without bloodshed. So it was a bloodless separation. When Norway became independent, it wanted to have a new king, and it was Fridtjof Nansen who went to Denmark to convince this Prince Karl to become the new king of Norway. And then finally, in his 50s, Fridtjof Nansen became a statesman, a humanitarian rather. After World War I ends, the League of Nations appoints him the first High Commissioner of Refugees. And he does such a good job in a variety of different humanitarian tasks that he is awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1922. So I tell people this one man accomplished as much as Lewis and Clark, Abraham Lincoln, and Martin Luther King. I mean, he did it all. But in a country like Norway that consisted of maybe 3.5 million people at the time, to have a father that famous, as I say, is both a blessing and a curse. So here's some facts about Nansen. As I mentioned, he's born in 1901. In 1927, he graduates from college with a degree in architecture, because again, he's very artistic like his parents are. He marries his sweetheart, a woman named Kari Hirsch. And as soon as he has his degree, and as soon as he's married, he immediately leaves Norway and moves to the United States, lives in Brooklyn for a while and practices as an architect in New York City. And I think, I'm sure there were a variety of reasons, of course, that impelled him to move to the United States. But I think the biggest reason, quite frankly, was that he just wanted to get out from under his father's shadow. I mean, he wanted to go to a place where he was going to be known for his own achievements, his own merits, not because of the reputation of his father. So he practices architecture for 3 years, and he's very successful in New York City doing that. And then in 1930, he gets word that his father is ill. He's got some kind of a heart ailment, and he's not doing very well. In fact, he's kind of slowly declining in health. So Nansen returns with his family, his wife and his first child, who was born in Brooklyn. Her name is Marit. And they arrive in time to see Fridtjof and say their goodbyes to him. And he passes away in May of 1930. At which point, Nansen decides, you know what, lo and behold, I don't need to move back to the United States again. Now I can live here in Norway. And again, I think it's because this shadow that was always kind of blotting out his place in the sun is not there anymore. He can kind of be his own person. And I think if we could go back in a time machine and interview Odd Nansen at this point and ask him at the kind of the start of his adulthood, his career, you know, how do you see your life unfolding at this point? I think he probably would have said, look, everything looks great to me. I mean, life is good after all. I've gotten some great work experience in the US. I'm going to start my own architectural firm now. I'm back in Oslo with all my classmates, the people I grew up with, all my neighbors. I've had my first child in America. I want to have more children, kind of grow my family. Everything looks great. But of course, we know that the storm clouds are already beginning to form over Europe. Late January, I think it's January 30th, 1933, Hitler is appointed Chancellor of Germany. He almost immediately starts persecuting the Jews. Many of them flee to Austria. Germany annexes Austria in 1938. Many of them then flee on to Czechoslovakia. In fact, young Tommy Bergenthal was born in Czechoslovakia of parents who had fled Germany in 1933. Both his mother and father fled Germany separately, met each other in Czechoslovakia, fell in love, married, and had Tommy. And all of these refugees, primarily Jewish refugees in Central Europe, have no place to go. They can't move anywhere because in many cases they don't have valid passports anymore. Their passports have expired. The only way to get a new passport is to go back to the country of its origin, which means going back to Germany, which of course most of these refugees are very loath to do. And even if they were willing to do that, even if they went back to Germany, they still probably couldn't get any kind of passport because under the Nuremberg laws of 1936, They've been denaturalized. They're not even considered citizens of the state of Germany. So a number of prominent Norwegians come to Odd Nansen in 1936, and they say there's this brewing refugee crisis in Central Europe. Something has got to be done about it. And we've all been thinking about this, and we've all decided you're the person to do something about it. So Nansen essentially is being asked to put his career on hold, put his family on hold, and to throw himself into what was really a thankless task. Because trying to get visas to allow these refugees to come into Norway was really an uphill battle. The government of Norway at the time was very anti-Semitic, as were the governments of all the Western powers, France, Germany, France, Great Britain, and even the United States, particularly the United States State Department. I mean, all these countries felt bad for what was happening to the Jews in Germany and in Austria and Czechoslovakia, but they didn't feel prepared or motivated to change their immigration laws or more refugees into the country. So as I say, Nansen is like Sisyphus, constantly rolling the boulder up the hill, trying to obtain visas to allow these refugees to come into Norway. And by the time World War II breaks out in 1939, he's been successful in bringing about 270 men, women, and children into the country. So to kind of sum up a little bit about who Nansen was, we know, number one, that he's educated. He's got a college degree at a time that not that many people went to college. We know he is artistic because he's an architect and he's inherited kind of the artistic sensibility from his mother and his father. We know he's famous. He's the bearer of the most famous name in all of Norway. And that's going to come to play as the war begins to heat up. So why did Nansen write the diary in the first place? Well, he says he never wrote it with the idea that he was ever going to publish this. Nansen had been keeping a journal, diary if you call it, since he was a teenager. So this was a kind of a natural habit for him in any event. But he says he wrote it for two primary reasons. He said, first, I wrote it for myself. He says, writing in my diary was, quote, like confiding in a close friend and relieving my mind of all that weighed on it. It became a private manner of forgetting. So I think if he wrote things down, then he didn't have to keep mentally revisiting them. It's kind of like when you write your grocery list. Once you've written down what you're going to purchase, you kind of put it out of your mind. You forget what it is. You know, hopefully you won't lose your grocery list, because then you're adrift once you're in the middle of the store trying to remember exactly what it was. He said the second reason why I wrote the diary was from my wife, Kari. I wanted her to know what was really going on in these camps. Now, he could write her letters, official letters that went through the camp system, but of course, everything he wrote in that sense was being censored. Somebody was reading everything that he wrote. She could occasionally get permission to visit him while he was in prison just outside of Oslo, but those visits were limited to 10 or 15 minutes. And as this sketch shows, this is one of the sketches, you can see not only is he separated from his family by a barrier, but there is a guard right there standing within arm's length of the two of them, listening to everything they say. And this guard had to be able to speak fluent Norwegian. So what can you say to your spouse in a situation like that? I mean, you can exchange pleasantries and things like that, but you really can't go into the details. So the diary became his way of explaining to her what was going on. And many of his diary entries begin with the words, "Dear Kari, listen to what happened today. I've got to tell you what happened while this memory is still fresh in my mind." And then many of his diary entries end with the words, "Good night, Kari." You know, in his mind, he's actually conversing with her. He's explaining to her kind of at the end of the day, everything that's going on. So let me share with you a couple of diary entries which talk about Nansen's relationship with his wife and how much, of course, he thought about her and how much he obsessed really about her and her health. He found out after he was arrested that she was pregnant with her fourth child. So I'd almost say he's obsessed with his wife. I mean, he thinks about her and writes about her almost all the time. So this first diary entry is from Saturday, May 23rd, 1942. Now, when Nansen's writing this diary entry, he himself is in solitary confinement. He was caught by the Germans writing a poem, which they considered to be an anti-German diatribe. So they throw him into solitary as a way of punishing him. But he writes, "I wonder where Kari is today. Is she sitting alone too? She may be unhappy for my sake. She must have heard by now that I'm, quote, inside, meaning that he's in solitary. But I'm writing, dear Kari, soon all these horrors will be over, and we shall live together again and be happy. I can't do anything without you, not even be in prison. Now, when he writes those words, he's been in prison, and soon we'll be together again, soon we'll be happy, soon these horrors will be over. He's been in prison for 4 months. He was arrested in January of 1942. What, of course, he doesn't know at this point, but we know through the benefit of hindsight, is it would take another 3 years plus before he is finally reunited with his wife. So compare the tone of that diary entry, which is so hopeful, so optimistic, with one that he writes 2 years later in the summer of 1944. In fact, he writes it on August 27th, which is the day of their wedding anniversary. This is what he writes. Today is our wedding day. 17 years. The third wedding day in prison. So in a way, that only makes 14. But 14 bright, rich years that have made it possible for me to get through these 3 dark ones. Life has been good to us after all. The wealth it has given us these 17 years, no one can take from us. It is of eternity and will never die, even though we should never meet again. So you can see where he's beginning to contemplate. He may never get out of this camp alive. The war just seems to go on and on. Nansen was convinced that the war was going to end in 42. Then he was certain it would end in 43. Here it is, the summer of 44, and it shows no signs of abating. And the longer you spend in a concentration camp, the greater your chances of something bad happening to you. Guard takes a shot at you. No one would even ask the guard to justify why they did that. You get an infectious disease like typhus. Typhus is spread by lice in overcrowding conditions. By the spring of 1945, Nansen's living in a barracks that was designed to hold 200 men, now holds over 500 men. These people are living like ants on top of each other. So why was Nansen arrested in the first place? Well, he was arrested, as I mentioned, in January of 1942, January 13th to be exact. And he was arrested in retaliation for a British commando raid on the coastline of Norway that occurred a few weeks before that, in late December 1941. In fact, it was right after Christmas, was on Boxing Day. These highly trained British commandos, they land at several points along the coastline of Norway. They quickly blow up a number of factories. They shoot a number of German soldiers who are guarding the factories, capture another number of German soldiers as POWs. 48 hours later, they're on their ships heading back to England. And this drove the German overlord furious that the British could pull this off and get away with it. And he was convinced that the Norwegian royal family, which was, for the most part, was living in exile in Great Britain and here in the United States, had put the British up to this. They were kind of egging the British on to do this. So he said, the way I'm going to get back, since I can't engage in a tit-for-tat raid against the coastline of England, I'm going to do something even better. I'm going to arrest the 20 most prominent citizens in this country and hold them as hostages. I'm not going to charge them with any crime. I don't care whether they committed a crime or not. And the more valuable these people are, the better they're going to make as a hostage. So you can imagine, since I earlier mentioned how famous the Nansen name was, that Odd Nansen was like probably exhibit number 1 on that list. So he gets picked up along with the royal physician, the royal chamberlain, all people who were both famous and had some connection with the royal family. And after all, the king of Norway was the person who Odd Nansen's father, Fridtjof Nansen, had brought over from Denmark back in 1905. So Nansen is thrown in prison as basically kind of a bargaining chip on an insurance policy, if you will, as a hostage, and never told when he's ever going to be released. And interestingly, of those 20 hostages, the only hostage who never got out before the end of the war was Odd Nansen. And I think part of that was because he was also a bitter enemy of a Norwegian named Vidkun Quisling. Now, some of you who know your World War II history may recognize that name. Quisling was a Norwegian, but he was a collaborator with the Nazis. And now the word Quisling has gotten into the dictionary. It means traitor. But I think if you step back and just read this diary and get to know the personality of Odd Nansen, you almost have to come to the conclusion that even if the British had never attacked the coastline of Norway, and even if Quisling had never even existed, that Nansen was going to end up in prison one way or the other. He was just one of these people who was very stubborn, like his father, and not particularly motivated to change his ways just to please the Nazis. And the number of ways you could get in trouble in occupied Norway were legion. Singing the national anthem could get you arrested. Owning a radio could get you arrested. Listening to the BBC could get you shot. Trying to escape from Norway to England could get you shot on sight. Refusing to sit next to a German soldier on the trolley or the bus could get you arrested. There was practically, Nansen says, everything you did probably broke some law or regulation. And Nansen, as I say, wasn't particularly concerned about changing his behavior. So let me read you a diary entry, which I think kind of sums up part of his philosophy and motivation, the way he acts. And in this particular diary entry, Nansen is talking about someone in his barracks who has the title of Blockout Tester. Blockout Tester is a German word that means barracks leader. And the Blockout Tester was a prisoner, number one, almost always a German prisoner, who was given the authority by the Nazi guards, the SS guards, to keep order and discipline within each of the barracks. And because these Blockout Tests had virtually unlimited authority to do anything they wanted, even though they themselves were prisoners, they tended to end up becoming as sadistic and as mean and as cruel as the SS guards were, if not even more so. But Nansen says in his particular barracks, the Blockout Tester, whose name is Ludwig, was actually a pretty decent guy. He says, Ludwig wouldn't even hurt a fly. And this is what he goes on to say about him. He says, Ludwig is one of the few who help to preserve something in oneself which must not be lost. It's not the corpses of human beings which are burned and annihilated here. It's not only the young, strong bodies which have turned into Musselmen, skeletons, and crematorium fuel. On this battlefield, the young faith and enthusiasm of thousands has gone under. The vital spark of thousands has been quenched in darkness and in brutishness. Ideals have vanished. Human kindness has turned to ice in many a heart. Faith in the future, the will and the force of good have withered as the muscles wither up to the useless dry tissue in the skeleton bodies of the Musselmen. But then he adds one final sentence, which to me is the kicker. He says, of all the mass murders, perhaps this is the worst. Now, here's somebody who sees death and destruction on a daily basis, who talks in his diary about having to straddle over a dead body to get to the urinal. And yet he's saying here that when human kindness turns to ice, when ideals vanish, that's the worst murder that's occurring. And I'm not really sure, to this day, I understand what Nansen was trying to convey in that last sentence. But about a year ago, I heard an interview on NPR. And this woman, her name was Esther Peril, was the daughter of two Holocaust survivors. And in her view, she said, she could kind of differentiate the Holocaust survivors into one of two groups. Those people who went on living, and those people, she said, who just simply did not die. And I think what she was trying to differentiate was the people who had lost their ability through the experience they went through of being unable to trust anyone again, being unable to empathize with anybody again, being unable to love one. They've lost all their attributes of humanity. They may be alive, but that's about it. And I think Nansen was determined to hold on to his humanity no matter what, because he felt losing that was almost worse than losing his own life. Now, I used a German word in that excerpt that I read to you. I used it twice. Musselmen. Musselmen means Muslim in German. And for reasons that no one's quite sure of even to this day, that term was given to those prisoners who were so emaciated, so weakened, that their lifespan was measured in days, if not in hours. You know, people who literally had one foot in the grave. And here's Nansen's sketch of a Musselman. I think when you see that sketch, it kind of conjures up, I think, in our own minds what we think of as the image of a concentration camp prisoner. In fact, you can see Nansen's own handwriting on the bottom of that picture. Now, who made up the majority of the Muslims in these camps? Of course, it was the Jews. The Jews had the worst of everything. Now, they weren't the only people who were treated pretty poorly. The Russians, Ukrainians, the Poles were brutalized in these camps because in that racial hierarchy that I mentioned earlier, the Germans put the Slavic race really way down at the bottom, really no more than one notch above the Jews. But as Elie Wiesel has said, although not all victims were Jews, all Jews were victims. And that's a distinction we always have to keep in mind. And whereas almost all these prisoners in these camps would treat the Jewish prisoners as pariahs, people you wanted to stay as far away from as possible, because basically nothing good could come to you from hanging around with a Jewish prisoner. But Nansen did just the opposite. He would go to the Jewish barracks and he would meet with these people and say, before you were in Sachsenhausen, were you in some other camp? What was it like there? Describe it for me. What did you do before the war? Where did you come from? Tell me about your family life. And many of these prisoners would say to him, we know we'll never get out of these camps alive, no matter how this war ends for Germany, one way or the other. So you have to be the person who tells our stories for us. And Nansen uses his diary as a way of telling the stories of these people he meets. He befriends a Jewish builder from Budapest who describes to him how he is captured in Yugoslavia and marched 500 miles up to Sachsenhausen, a march that started with 3,000 able-bodied men and ends up with only 850 actually walking into the camp alive. And this is what he goes on to write about this Jewish builder that he has befriended. He says, this is from December 18th, 1944. There's one touching detail I must relate about this man. I've given him a few clothes and some cigarettes and some food. He was very anxious to show his gratitude. One day he came to me with a little thing that he wanted to give me as a souvenir. I had to promise to keep it. It was, he said, the very best thing he owned. He had nothing else. It was one of the cigarettes that he had borrowed from me, now neatly wrapped up in silver paper. I had given him only 3 cigarettes that time. I was in rather low water myself. After the war, he added, he would give me the same present in gold and precious stones. Now, why would anybody make such an extravagant offer like that, to give a gift like that? I'm sure this man was grateful for the food and the tobacco that Nansen had given him. I tend to think he was showing his gratitude for was something that was even more valuable to him because it was probably even more rare in these camps. And that was the gift of friendship, the gift of empathy, of listening to somebody else's story. Almost everybody else is telling everybody, look, don't tell me your sob stories. I've got enough problems of my own. But Nansen wasn't like that. He was outer directed. So how did Nansen manage to write and preserve a diary inside of a concentration camp? Well, Nansen says writing it wasn't that difficult. Nansen was one of these people who, like his father, much like his father, could operate on practically no sleep. He could stay up until 2 o'clock, 2:30 in the morning and get up at 4:30 and go back to work. So he would use those hours when everybody else was asleep to write the pages of the diary. And he says hiding it wasn't that difficult. I would put it in the one place I knew the German guards would never go, the latrine. They weren't going into the latrine under any circumstances. So the real issue was getting the pages of the diary out of the camp. Well, for 18 months, Nansen was kept in different prisons in Norway. And you have to think about it. The only people coming in and out of the camp in Norway are fellow Norwegian civilians. These are the people behind the barbed wire are their neighbors, their cousins, their in-laws. So everybody was trying to smuggle something out of the camp. And they had all sorts of ingenious methods, of course, to do that. So Nansen was very successful in periodically smuggling portions of his diary out as he wrote them. But then he gets in trouble with the commandant at this camp just outside of Oslo. The commandant says, now I'm going to send you to a real concentration camp, a camp in Germany. And you might as well tell your family to put up a headstone for you now, because you're not going to come home from this experience. And that's when he is sent to Sachsenhausen. He arrives in October of 1943, at which point he writes, I don't know how I'm ever going to get this diary out of this camp. There's no one willing to help me smuggle this out. I'm in the middle of an enemy territory. But he writes, it is psychologically so important to me just to keep writing that I have to keep doing this and hoping that I can think of some solution before the war ends. And frankly, if I can't think of any way to get this thing out of the camp, assuming I'm still alive when the war ends, I will bury the whole thing in the ground, I guess with the idea of coming back and retrieving it. And diaries have been found buried in the ground at other concentration camps, primarily in Auschwitz. So people were thinking the same thing that Nansen was thinking. But then Nansen says, one day I had a brainstorm. And I realized that even though I, and along with all the other prisoners, when we left the camp in the morning to go to work, because all the work had to be done outside the camp. It was so crowded. There was no work squads inside. And we were searched every night when we came back in. The Germans, when they were searching us, were really primarily concerned about weapons. They were worried that we would somehow get our hands on weapons, then stage an uprising. But after all, there had been an uprising in Auschwitz. There had been an uprising in Treblinka. There had been an uprising in Sobibor. He says, so as a result, the guards really paid that much attention to the two things that we prisoners carried with us almost at all times. One was a tin cup that we would carry around our waist with a string, so whenever we had a chance to drink something, we could drink it. And the other thing he said many prisoners had was something they called a breadboard. A piece of wood about this big, maybe measuring 4 by 8 inches or so. And in the morning, when you line up in your barracks, that blockhouse tester I mentioned before, you'd line up and you hold out your breadboard, and he'd put your daily bread ration. You'd get half a loaf or a third of a loaf or a quarter of a loaf of black bread, and you did with what you wanted. You either gobbled it all up then, or you saved some of it, or you bartered it for something else. But you always had this, it was kind of like a utility work service, an eating service that every prisoner could at least maintain some control over their lives. And Nansen says, I finally had a brainstorm, and I realized I could take my breadboard and go to one of my friends in the carpentry shop and ask him to split my breadboard open lengthwise and hollow out the inside of it. And I would put the pages of the diary in my breadboard. And then when it was filled, I'd glue it back together, and no one would have a clue as to what I had done. So at the end of the war, Nansen and 5 of his closest friends walk out with their breadboards, and that's how he's able to smuggle the entire German portion of his diary out. And this is a real breadboard. This is not Nansen's. Nansen's is on display in Norway's World War II Museum. And as you can see from the image on the right, that the paper he was writing on was like tissue paper, very, very thin. What's a little bit harder to tell from this picture is that his handwriting there is microscopically small, such that when the typists went to transcribe these handwritten pages into the text for publication, they needed magnifying glasses. So that was how Nansen was able to preserve his entire diary. So we've talked about who Nansen was. We've talked about why he wrote the diary, why he was arrested in the first place. We've talked about how he preserved the diary. And of course, this diary has everything in it, every kind of experience you can imagine, including horror. I mean, it's a concentration camp diary. But to me, the power of this diary, and the reason why I spent 6 years of my life trying to get it back into print, is not the horror, it's the power of Nansen's example, the example of a man who somehow keeps his humanity in the most inhumane conditions mankind has ever conceived of. Now, Nansen could have walked right by Tommy, could have ignored him like every other prisoner had ignored him, could have said to himself, there is no point in getting involved with a 10-year-old Jewish child with amputated toes. I mean, his chances of survival are practically nil. But Nansen didn't do that. He got involved with Tommy, even though he writes, as I quoted to you in the beginning of my lecture, even though those feelings were painful, probably getting involved and feeling the hurt that would follow him in case Tommy did not make it. Since I began my story with Tommy's march from Auschwitz to Sachsenhausen, let me kind of come full circle, tell you what ultimately would become of him. He survived the war, as I mentioned. His mother also survived the war in a women's camp called Ravensbrück in Germany. His father did not make it. He died in January 1945 of pneumonia in Buchenwald. And it would take Tommy and his mother another year and a half after the war ends to even find each other in war-torn Europe. But eventually they are reunited. That's almost another whole story in itself. And she takes him back, his mother takes him back to Germany to raise him. Now, at least until Tommy's liberated in the spring of 1945, he's completely illiterate. Tom has never been in a classroom in his life. He's been a prisoner since he was a 5-year-old child. And he explains to Nansen that in the Kielce ghetto, where he lived with his mother and father, it was a capital crime for Jewish parents to teach their children how to read and write. His parents could have been shot if they tried doing that. So this kid has no education at all, nothing. So when he gets back to Germany with his mother, she hires a tutor. He says to the tutor, I want you to teach my son in 12 months, just 1 year, everything that he should have learned in grades 1 through 7. So at the end of that 1 year, I can enroll him in the 8th grade, which is the grade he should have been in according to his age. So he has a year of tutoring. He enters the 8th grade. He goes 9th grade, 10th grade, starts the 11th grade. Now he's a young teenager. He's 16 years old. And he's starting to think about his own future. And he knows that he doesn't want to spend it in Germany for reasons that we can appreciate. And fortunately for him, he has an aunt and uncle who live in New Jersey, Paterson, New Jersey. So he emigrates to the United States. He arrives in January 1952. Now, at this point, this young child has a total of 3.5 years of any formal education, 3.5 years of any English instruction. He didn't know English before the war. Now he's arriving in the middle of a school year in a foreign country where everybody speaks nothing but English. Well, he manages to graduate from Paterson High School. He goes to a small liberal arts college in West Virginia, and 4 years later, he graduates as the valedictorian of his college class. He then goes on to NYU Law School, gets a legal degree. From there, he goes on to Harvard Law School, and he gets a master's degree and a doctorate in the field of international law and human rights. And he goes on to have one of the most spectacularly successful careers you can imagine. And that culminates in the year 2000 when Tom is appointed to the International Court of Justice at The Hague. And that's a picture of Tom Bergenthal in his judicial robes. Tom is now 86 years old. He lives in retirement outside of Washington, D.C., and we have become extremely close friends over these past 11 years. He's written a new introduction to this new diary, a diary that was dedicated to him by Nansen back in 1947. So just an incredible, incredible story. And as I say, one of the most unexpected benefits to me is my personal relationship with Tom Bergenthal, one of the most amazing human beings I've ever met. So I'm going to read you one final diary entry, which to me sums up everything that I've tried to describe to you about Nansen. The date of this diary entry is March 5th, 1945. Nansen has just learned that he's going to be moved from Sachsenhausen to yet another concentration camp, a camp called Neuengamme. So he goes to Tommy and he says, Tommy, this is the hardest thing I've had to do in my 3.5 years as a prisoner, and that is to say goodbye and leave you behind. So you have to promise me that you will write to me when the war ends and tell me how you made out. And Tommy's response is, yes, of course I'll do that. After all, it is my duty. And Nansen is so struck by the fact that he uses this word duty that he riffs on it in this diary entry. Now, as I'm reading this, just remember that when Nansen's writing this, he doesn't know the war is about to end. At this point, he had given up worrying about when the war was going to end. He doesn't know whether Neuengamme is going to be better or worse. It turns out to be even worse than Sachsenhausen was. He doesn't know whether he'll continue to get these Red Cross food parcels at this point. If he doesn't get them, he's going to turn into a Muslim just like every other prisoner in these camps. And yet with all of that weighing on him, just listen to these words, how eloquent they are, how hopeful, how compassionate, and knowing what we know of what became of Tom Bergenthal, how incredibly prophetic these words are. And he writes, little Tommy, if only your fellow creatures thought a fraction as much about their duty to you as you do about yours to them, all your prospects would be brighter than they are today. Thank God you don't realize that, and may you never realize the abyss of vile injustice that has been done to you. May there be such a future in store for you that all this frightful, this unintelligible cruelty will be expunged from your mind. May you discover that life is not like that. The world is not as it looked to you from the floor of the cattle car when you cried because you were so terribly cold. May you one day grasp and experience its richness in all the warmth and joy, all the beaming light that are reflected in those big eyes of yours, too shrewd for a child's, and which are a reminder and evidence of what you were meant to be. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation. I think we have time, hopefully, lots of time for Q&A. I will just mention to you that this is my website. I'd love to have you come to my website and learn more about Nansen, or write to me at my email address. If you're interested in the book, of course, you can get it on Amazon. But if you go to my website, you can order a personalized copy, and I'm happy to inscribe it in any way, shape, or form that you would like. I would mention to you that I make no money from the sale of these books. I have donated, since the day this was published in 2016, 100% of my royalties and 100% of my speaking fees go to the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. They get 50% of my earnings. And the other 50% go to the Center for the Study of the Holocaust in Oslo. So it's all for a good cause. And with that, I will ask Sarah to help me respond to any questions that may have shown up in the chat room, and so they can answer them. Sarah?
Yes. Okay, great. Tim, thank you so much. This is such an incredible story, and you can see how dedicated you are to it, and just the connection you have to this story is incredible. And you told this story so beautifully. Thank you.
Well,
So
thank you.
we have a few questions here.
I'm going to stop the share here.
That'd be great. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so one of the questions that we received was from Jim, and he said, "What a rich historical document. Do you foresee filmmakers in the future offering options on creation of a documentary on Odd Nansen with content based on your highly researched book?"
Well, I'm still waiting for Mr. Spielberg to give me a call. It hasn't happened yet, but I am convinced that at some point somebody will read this diary and be as struck as I was the first time I read it 11 years ago. How absolutely cinematic this book is. It's almost visual as you're reading it. I can't imagine how much more powerful it can be in the hands of somebody who's very creative. Yeah. So sooner or later that's going to happen, but it hasn't happened yet, but to be continued.
Okay, and someone else asked, does he know how bad the camps were in Norway? So,
well, the camps were, they weren't considered concentration camps per se. They were considered police detention camps. But you know, they had barbed wire and armed guards. They did not usually have gas chambers and crematoria as the large concentration camps in Europe did. But they were generally pretty brutal. I mean, over time, lots of people still lost their lives. And as I say, if you were caught trying to escape from England, you were taken out into the woods and executed. So there were still a number of Norwegians who lost their lives. But I think, as I mentioned, once Nansen is sent from this Camp Grini, which is still the maximum security prison to this day outside of the outskirts of Oslo, the commandant was saying, look, you think this is bad, wait till you get to Germany. And when he gets there, he says, now that I'm here after 1 week, my life I had in this police detention camp, Grini, was almost idyllic compared to how bad this is. And then, as I mentioned, when he gets to Neuengamme, he says, I thought Sachsenhausen was bad. If death stalked the streets of Sachsenhausen, it galloped here in Neuengamme, it was even worse at that point. So he certainly saw his share of some incredibly difficult conditions in both Sachsenhausen and Neuengamme, which consisted of about 18 months of his incarceration.
Okay, well, I have another one.
Okay.
Someone asked, did Odd Nansen and Tom ever see each other again after the war?
Great question.
Great question.
As I mentioned, it took Tommy and his mother 18 months to even find each other in war-torn Europe. But when Tommy is reunited with his mother in December of 1946, he says to his mother, Mutti, you know, the reason why I'm alive today is because a Norwegian saved my life. Unfortunately, I can't remember his name anymore. Now, Tommy has probably, just in those 18 months after the war ends, he's a refugee with the Polish army for a number of months, finally ends up in an orphanage outside of Warsaw. He's probably gone through more experiences than you and I will go through in our lifetime. So and he was illiterate, so even if he saw Nansen's name, he wouldn't have recognized it. So it seems like the trail kind of ends there at that point. How are we ever going to find out? Until Tommy's mother reads in a refugee newspaper how a Norwegian has just published his diary in Norway, and that diary covers 18 months of his incarceration in Sachsenhausen, and how that diary is the #1 bestseller in Norway in 1947. So now Tommy's mother says, why don't you write to this man, the man who wrote this diary? Maybe he can help you find the person you're looking for. So Tommy writes this letter, Dear Mr. Nansen, I understand you published a diary, you were in Sachsenhausen. I'm looking for the man who saved my life. And perhaps it's even you, I can't remember anymore. And if it's not you, could you help me find the person I'm looking for so I can thank this person properly? And this is all, he writes about this in Tom's memoir. He says, once I finished writing this letter, I put it in an envelope and I addressed it, Mr. Odd Nansen, Norway. That's it. Mails this letter off, and either Nansen is as famous as I think he is, or the Norwegian Postal Service is pretty darn good. But of course, this letter does get to Tommy, does get to Odd Nansen rather, and he writes in his memoir. Some weeks go by, and one day there's a knock on their apartment door. They go to the front door, Tom does, and there's these Norwegian soldiers standing there. The city that he was living in Germany, Göttingen, was part of the British occupation zone, and they used Norwegian soldiers as part of their occupation force. So these soldiers ask him, is this the Birkenthal residence? He says, yes. They said, well, we've got a package for you. And he says, these soldiers go to the back of this army truck and take off this gigantic wooden crate, bring it into their apartment, put it on the floor, take out a crowbar, pry open the top of it. And he says, I peer into this box, and it's filled with chocolate and sardines and cheese and all the food that you can't get in post-war Germany. And on the top of this package is a letter, of course it's written in German, that begins, mein lieber Tommy, my dear, dear Tommy. And Nansen flew down to Germany, met Tommy's mother, took Tommy back to Norway to live with him for the summer by the fjord so he could get his strength back. And they remained very close friends for the rest of their lives until Nansen passed away in June of 1973. That's just a great question. Thank you.
It is a wonderful question. And really, we unfortunately only have time for one more. And I think this is a great question.
Okay.
How significant or rare is it to have a diary from the perspective of a non-Jewish prisoner? And how does having the different perspective add to our understanding of life in the camps?
Well, that one I could probably take me a half an hour to think it through, another half an hour to try to explain it. Sure. As I mentioned, diaries are extremely rare of any kind. And the number of diaries ever translated into English is really no more than, as far as I can tell, between 5 or 6. I mean, unless you can read Yiddish or Czech or Polish, you can't read what little has been written inside these camps. What I view the importance of this diary is not only as a historical record, but as a non-Jew, I think it just adds more credence to, I mean, Nansen was an observer, and a very acute observer of what was happening to the Jews in these camps. Now, he had the luxury of writing this diary. Primo Levi says, most of the Jewish prisoners were so badly treated, they didn't even have, nearly the kind of energy. So Nansen knows that he's a privileged prisoner, and he uses this privilege to bear witness to what's going on. And he writes in the diary, he says, I'm not sure anybody will believe what I'm writing here, that some of these scenes are so ghastly, they beggar the imagination. And I'm not even sure that anybody will believe what I've written when the war is over. So I think this stands as a testament. I mean, I'm not going to get into discussing Holocaust denial and things like that, which are so crazy, but this is a real life, real-time record of life in these camps. And Nansen doesn't spare himself. He doesn't even spare his fellow Norwegians. He says many of them were anti-Semitic. They had a privileged life, and yet they still wouldn't share what they were getting from these food parcels. It was a crime. So he's critical of everybody, and he's even critical of himself. He says, I think I should have done even more to try to help these other disadvantaged prisoners. So I'm not sure that's completely responsive to that question. I'm not sure I'm capable of responding adequately to a question.
That was a big question. And there are so many questions. I mean, really, you've left everyone with so much to ask, so much to think about. It's wonderful. Well, I wish we could have you for an hour longer, and we could continue on with this. But sounds like people can write to you if they have.
Yes, please. Again, if you remember my name, Tim Boyce, or if you want to, from your end, if you can perhaps just give my website, I would be delighted to hear from people. Absolutely. And answer their questions. Nothing would interest me more than connecting with my audience. And again, hopefully some of you are interested in reading the book. To me, more than any other reason, the reason why I do this is because I want to share what I have found. I have found a treasure. which is this diary. And I want people to experience, if you read this diary, you cannot be unaffected or unchanged. There is just no human way that that can happen. That's just my own personal feeling. And so that's why I proselytize as much as I do for this.
Well, thank you. I think you're a treasure. I think the fact that you I think, you know, it doesn't always happen that people connect to something like this and really feel this call to action to share this and make sure that people know about it. So I think that's wonderful. And I want to thank you again for coming here and being a part of this, showing, you know, this program tonight. It was really special. I also want to thank all of you who attended tonight. And we will offer a link to the recorded event, and
great.
Yeah, to make sure that everybody can watch it. I know some people weren't able to get in right away. And I want to also thank our partner, the Harry and Rose Sampson Family Jewish Community Center. And just to remind all of you, if you enjoyed this program tonight, if you want to see more programming like this, please donate. It helps us so that we can offer these kinds of programs. And again, thank you, and everyone have a wonderful evening.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much. Entirely my pleasure.